This is your PowerPoint for the PowerPoint quiz on the English colonies in the 1700s. Puritan Revolutions. James I and Charles I tried to win control over the English Parliament. However, Oliver Cromwell eventually attacked Charles I and had him beheaded. This revolution, called Cromwell's Revolution, failed after 10 years. Cromwell became a dictator. Once he died, the English allowed Charles II and James II to return. But they eventually saw these two kings as being too Catholic in the way that they attempted to centralize control of the Church of England underneath the king. So they eventually invited William and Mary of Orange back to England in the Glorious Revolution. Dissenters in New England. Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson eventually dissented against the Puritans. Roger Williams criticized the Puritans for their maltreatment of natives. He also disagreed with a state-centered church. He believed in the freedom of conscience. Now, be careful with this. This doesn't mean that Roger Williams was not a Puritan. In fact, Roger Williams would have argued that he was more Puritan than the Puritans themselves. For him, he believed that only God saved. So if the church of the community forced people into belief, they were violating the idea of predestination. By allowing for freedom of individual conscience, he believed that he was actually giving God his true sovereignty. Eventually, the Puritans exiled him, and he was sent out, and he began to form Rhode Island. Anne Hutchinson also dissented against the Puritans. She believed in a doctrine called antinomianism, which was against all man-made authority. Once again, be careful with this. Many people think Anne Hutchinson was a liberal for her time or a feminist for her time. She would argue that she was more Puritan than the Puritans. If it's really true that God saves people and makes them good, then why would we need authority against us? In her belief system, every individual who is saved by God is their own obedient servant to God and therefore needs no mediator. She argued that predestination meant people could go straight to God and needed no leadership. Eventually, this led to conflict with the Puritan male authorities, who obviously were upset at her for two reasons. One, that she was stripping them of their power, and two, that she was attacking males as a female. She was eventually kicked out of the colony. She was headed down to Rhode Island when she was captured by Native Americans and eventually killed. The Pequot Wars. The Massachusetts colony expanded out into Connecticut. They allied with the Narragansett Indians and eventually attacked the Pequots at Mystic River. They did a massacre that killed all the men, women, and children. Any survivors were sold off into slavery. 5 years later, they then attacked the leader of the Narragansett tribe. This led to the chief of the Wampanoags, King Philip, to attack the Puritans. Puritans then allied with the Iroquois to defeat King Philip. The impact of this was that the Puritans feared that they had displeased God and that this would lead to an end to the Puritan experiment of a godly city on a hill. The transatlantic trade. The major areas of trade included the following: New England with timber, South Carolina and Georgia with rice, the Chesepeake, or what we today call Virginia, with tobacco, and the Caribbean with sugar and molasses. All of these areas led to a major contest between Britain and France over the Caribbean. The effects of Puritan culture. Puritan descendants eventually accepted John Locke's political philosophy, in which he called for natural rights, but notice how this ties in with the Puritan belief that natural rights come from God. This also led to a creation of colleges throughout the colonies. The major purpose of these colonies at first was not really education for education's sake, but rather education for the ministry and the proclamation of Christianity. These included Yale, Harvard, and Princeton. Puritan mercantile beginnings also led to major cities, and cities would increase the problems of division between economic classes and urban congestion. Effects of the Chesapeake culture. The Virginia region was mainly settled for economic purposes. Eventually, John Rolfe discovered tobacco. So tobacco, being a labor-intensive crop, meant that there was some need to find a good source of labor that would allow for this. The first attempt was through the headright system, which allowed for indentured servants to be paid for to come from the English lower classes. However, this eventually led to African slave labor. The reason was limited land that could not be given to indentured servants. Slavery. The Triangle Trade. The trade of slaves from Africa to the New World and profit back to Europe is known as the Triangle Trade. Actually, if you look at the way trade took place with slavery, there was no perfect triangle. But when we try to make it into a simple model, it looks somewhat like a triangle because it includes these three major continents: Europe to Africa to the Caribbean and back to Europe. The Middle Passage is known within African American history as the voyage of slaves from Africa to the Caribbean. Along that passage, 18% of slaves died due to typhus, yellow fever, malaria, dysentery, and smallpox. Slaves in the Americas first rebelled in the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina, but they were defeated at Charleston by a white militia. This eventually led to strict rules on how to deal with runaway slaves. The Paxton Boys. In Pennsylvania, a group of Dissenters had formed a new religion called the Quakers. The Quakers believed in something called the inner light of God in all people. Because every single person had the inner light of God, they had to be valued as being transcendent or being children of God with God in them. This meant that you could not do violence to other people. So Quakers practiced pacifism or nonviolence for all people. This also meant that they made treaties over land with natives. Eventually, this angered some of the other migrants who were not Quakers in the community. For example, the local Scots-Irish population. Part of this group, known as the Paxton Boys, eventually took over the colony and ended all treaties with the Conestoga Indians. Reason versus religion. Eventually, the major conflict that would come out of this religious era was the issue of Enlightenment secular reason versus Puritan religion. Enlightenment in Europe had stressed goodness of human rationality. It led to a belief in things like natural rights. It also led to a political belief in something called the social contract, or an agreement between people and the government that put the people in charge. Within America, this eventually led to a type of religious belief called deism. According to deists, God had created the universe and natural laws, and then let the universe act on its own. In this type of belief, God is most analogous to a great clockmaker. In other words, God makes the clock, lets it run on its own, and then allows those laws to take over. Where is God? We really don't know. He took off a long time ago. But the point is that these natural laws that we can come to understand given to us by God allow us to manipulate these laws and to make the world a better place. The New Lights. The notion of deism was strongly challenged not by Puritans had disappeared by this time, but by their descendants, especially George Whitefield. George Whitefield stressed the intuitive relationship with God and the fear of salvation. He disagreed with those ministers coming from a deist background who had adopted the view of human rationality as the way to God. For Whitefield, human rationality was corrupted like all other things by original sin. We must approach God then through fear and trembling. Whitefield would establish huge rallies in plains and backwoods of the northern and southern states, and his emotional appeals drew thousands of settlers looking for a more sincere approach to God based upon intuition and a deep sense of faith and feeling of God's presence in one's life. The spillover into politics. The New Lights criticized the ministers of the Anglican Church, who they saw as deist, for lacking a sincere approach to God. But think carefully about this. The ministers who are part of the Anglican Church ultimately come under the authority of the king. So this led to an attack on the king himself, since the Anglican ministers were his representatives. Also, Whitefield had appealed to the poor. The poor saw the Anglican ministers as the wealthy upper class. This is not meaning that Whitefield was some sort of modern-day socialist. Whitefield at that time period had no knowledge of those types of belief systems. They really were only starting to form out in Europe. For Whitefield, the type of belief that he was talking about was a sense of Puritan communalism, in which basically everybody had to be taken care of for the good of the community. Whitefield noticed that the Anglican ministers had stored up so much wealth that the poor people were starting to break away from the church and to form a sense of selfishness and individualism and a sense of being left out by the community. Early political tensions. The colonists had established local legislatures. Governors were usually appointed by the king. Local governors could veto laws, dismiss judges, and conduct diplomacy with Indians. However, the colonists had a huge power over these governors. The local assemblies could check the governor by setting his salary. Since the king was so far away, the most important people would be these local assemblies who were colonists. The colonists saw the assemblies as the one and only main check on the king's representative. This would become very important for the American Revolution. Global wars. The Wars of Succession. During the early 1700s, there were a number of major wars between the superpowers. For example, there was the War of the Augsburgs. France tried to fill the vacuum of Spain, and this led to the weakening of French lands in America. There was then the War of Spanish Succession. France united with Spain but lost Caribbean possessions to Britain. There was the War of Jenkins' Ear, which became a fight between Protestant and Catholic communities. And probably the most important out of all these wars would be the French and Indian War, in which George Washington accidentally went to survey land and created a skirmish with the French. The result of this was the 7 Years' War in Europe. The French and Indian War. The Iroquois and the British allied together during the French and Indian War. The Huron and the French allied together. William Pitt took over the prime minister position in England as the English were losing this war. He increased the military budget and oversaw an English victory. The reason why this is so significant is that at the end of the French and Indian War, the French were kicked out of North America permanently. The colonists at that point no longer felt the need for British protection, and this would become important for the American Revolution. Once the French were gone, the American colonists no longer saw a need for them to have the British meddle in their affairs.